What happens when Germany steps into science fiction? The result isn't polite starships or safe adventures, it's films that rattled audiences with strange visions, daring ideas, and sometimes eerie predictions. From Cold War allegories to psychedelic space operas, these movies pushed boundaries far beyond expectations. Some felt campy, some unsettling, and a few were shockingly ahead of their time. Let's dive into 15 German sci-fi films that left audiences stunned, confused, and utterly captivated. Space Patrol Orion, Raumpatrouille, Die fantastischen Abenteuer des Raumschiffes Orion, 1966. When West German audiences tuned into Space Patrol Orion in the fall of 1966, they were expecting a modest TV series. Instead, they got the country's first real attempt at space adventure, and it was unlike anything they had seen before. The show was made on a tiny budget, yet the production team turned everyday items into futuristic props. Ironing boards became control panels, sparkling drinks became high-tech gadgets, and disco lighting transformed simple sets into cosmic landscapes. It looked campy, but it also looked fresh, playful, and daring. Commander Cliff Alistair McLean and his crew weren't the grim heroes of American or Soviet productions. They were stylish, witty, and cosmopolitan, representing a vision of a forward-looking modern Germany. That mix of humor and high concept shocked critics who dismissed it as silly. But young viewers ate it up, turning the show into a cult phenomenon. Later re-edited into a theatrical film, Orion cemented itself as a cultural milestone. For a country still wrestling with its past, seeing a glamorous, optimistic future on screen was both startling and inspiring. It wasn't just television anymore, it was proof that Germany could imagine tomorrow in its own quirky, unforgettable way. Back to cinema with Orion, Raumschiff Orion, Rücksturz ins Kino, 1977. By 1977, the cult around Orion had grown so big that producers decided to re-edit episodes into a feature film called Back to Cinema with Orion. What shocked audiences wasn't the story itself, it was how something once confined to television suddenly commanded the big screen. On cinema screens, the low-budget charm became both hilarious and delightful. Viewers could clearly see the improvised props, sparkling costumes, and cardboard-like sets. But instead of diminishing the experience, the absurdity magnified the nostalgia. People laughed, cheered, and celebrated the quirks that once made critics roll their eyes. This move was radical for its time. German studios rarely believed TV content could cross into theaters, and yet Orion proved them wrong. Audiences were shocked to find themselves paying for tickets to watch episodes they had once seen at home and loving every second of it. The release also came during the global Star Wars craze. Against George Lucas's groundbreaking effects, Orion looked like a glittery antique. But that contrast became part of its charm. It was Germany's cheeky, homemade answer to the blockbuster age. The shock wasn't just in the movie itself, but in the realization that scrappy, campy sci-fi could thrive in a galaxy ruled by Hollywood. Signals, a space adventure, Signale, ein Weltraumabenteuer. 1970. In 1970, East Germany decided to launch its own space epic, Signals, a space adventure. Funded by the DEFA studios, it was meant to prove that socialist cinema could be just as spectacular as anything from the West. And for audiences used to domestic dramas, it was jaw-dropping. The film followed astronauts racing against time to rescue a stranded ship. What shocked viewers wasn't just the suspense, but the sheer size of the sets. Gleaming spacecraft, blinking control panels, and weightless corridors filled the screen with a futuristic scale rarely seen in East German productions. Even more surprising was the tone. Unlike the camp of Orion Signals, played it completely straight. Its astronauts weren't mavericks, but disciplined comrades reflecting the ideals of cooperation and order. For East German viewers, the film wasn't just entertainment, it was a glimpse of a collective future. Western critics were startled too. While some saw it as propaganda, others admired its ambition and craft. For audiences, the shock lay in discovering that their local studios could deliver spectacle that looked global. Signals wasn't just a movie, it was a cinematic statement. Space belonged to everyone, not just Hollywood. The Silent Star, Der Schweigende Stern, 1960. Released in 1960. The Silent Star shocked audiences with a heavy story that felt all too real. A co-production between East Germany and Poland, it was adapted from a Stanisław Lem novel and tackled the theme of nuclear destruction head-on. The film begins with the discovery of an alien artifact pointing to Venus. When scientists investigate, they uncover evidence that the planet's inhabitants destroyed themselves with weapons of mass destruction. For viewers only 15 years removed from World War II, this wasn't just sci-fi, it was a chilling reflection of their worst fears. The visuals added to the impact. Towering sets, bold costumes, and surreal colors gave the impression of a strange, dangerous world. Unlike American pulp sci-fi of the era, this film treated the subject with grave seriousness. It asked not what aliens might do to us, but what we might do to ourselves. Some critics found it too heavy-handed, but audiences were rattled by the message. The idea that humanity's destructive tendencies could echo across the galaxy hit hard in the Cold War era. The Silent Star shocked, because it wasn't escapism at all, it was a cosmic warning, disguised as adventure. In the Dust of the Stars, Im Staub der Sterne, 1976. If The Silent Star unsettled audiences with dread, In the Dust of the Stars unsettled them with pure strangeness. Released in 1976, this DEFA production exploded with disco-era colors, psychedelic dances, and surreal visuals. Beneath the glitter, though, lay a sharp allegory about exploitation. The story followed astronauts lured to a distant planet by a fake distress signal. Once there, they encountered a ruling elite who masked the suffering of enslaved workers. The contrast between flashy costumes, neon lights, and grim subject matter was unlike anything East German audiences had ever seen. Critics were baffled. Was it political satire, a cosmic fever dream, a sci-fi musical? Younger viewers embraced the wild creativity, while traditionalists were shocked by the sheer audacity. The choreography, the psychedelic camera work, and the surreal tone all defied expectations of East German cinema. What made the film unforgettable was that it dared to be chaotic in a controlled society. In the Dust of the Stars, shocked not with fear, but with spectacle. It showed that even under restrictions, filmmakers could smuggle in bold critiques disguised as dazzling sci-fi fantasy. Operation Ganymede, 1977. When Operation Ganymede aired on German television in 1977, viewers were stunned. Instead of sleek heroes and glittering starships, they found a story about astronauts broken by failure, clinging to hope in the void. It was haunting, slow, and shockingly realistic. The plot followed a crew returning from a disastrous mission to Jupiter's moon Ganymede. Their ship limped back toward Earth, damaged and nearly out of resources. The men were exhausted, traumatized, and unsure if they'd ever survive re-entry. The usual optimism of sci-fi was stripped away. What remained was raw despair, captured with chilling detail. Audiences expecting escapism were blindsided. The sets were claustrophobic, the pacing deliberate, and the dialogue heavy with frustration. Viewers felt trapped with the astronauts suffocated by their hopelessness. For German television, which usually leaned toward light drama, this was unprecedented. Critics admired its bravery. Some compared it to Tarkovsky's Solaris, praising its psychological realism. Others thought it was simply too bleak. But whether loved or loathed, nobody forgot it. Operation Ganymede shocked because it dared to portray space not as a place of wonder, but as a mirror of human fragility. In the end, the film left audiences with an unsettling truth. Space doesn't care if you're ready or not. Survival is never guaranteed, and sometimes even the bravest missions return empty. Enemy Mine, 1985. Few sci-fi films have combined spectacle and emotion the way Enemy Mine did in 1985. A West German-American co-production shot largely at Bavaria Studios, it shocked audiences with its scale and its message of tolerance. The story began with two pilots, one human, one alien, locked in combat. Both crash-landed on a barren planet, stranded together. They first tried to destroy each other, but survival forced them into uneasy cooperation. Over time, their hostility gave way to friendship, then mutual respect. For Cold War audiences, this message was groundbreaking. Sometimes your enemy is the one who saves you. German viewers were floored by the film's scope. Elaborate alien landscapes, cutting-edge prosthetics, and Hollywood-style action sequences were unlike anything local studios had produced. It proved Germany could host productions on the same level as America. But the real shock was the emotion. The alien played by Louis Gossett Jr. raised a child after his own death, with the human pilot stepping in as surrogate parent. This twist gave the film an unexpected heart-moving audiences who thought they'd come for lasers and explosions. Critics were divided. Some thought it sentimental, others praised its depth. Yet its impact was undeniable. Enemy minds shocked, not just with visuals, but with humanity showing that empathy could be the most powerful force in the galaxy. War of the Planets. Der Kampf der Planeten, 1966. German-Italian co-productions in the 1960s were often campy, but War of the Planets stood out for its sheer audacity. Released in 1966, it shocked audiences with gaudy colors, bizarre dialogue, and space battles that looked both silly and strangely hypnotic. The story followed astronauts attempting to save Earth from mysterious cosmic forces. The sets were drenched in neon costumes, looked like glittery leftovers from stage productions, and the dialogue veered from stiff to absurd. By most standards, it should have been forgettable, yet people couldn't look away. The shock came from its boldness. German audiences weren't accustomed to such wild spectacle. While Hollywood dazzled with 2001, A Space Odyssey, soon after this co-production, dared to offer its own galactic chaos, complete with laser flashes and exploding models. Critics mocked it, but fans embraced the energy. For younger audiences, War of the Planets was a gateway. It showed them that European studios could dream of cosmic wars too, even if the execution was unpolished. Over time, it developed cult status, celebrated for its over-the-top visuals and campy charm. At the time, though, audiences were shocked simply because it existed. Germany, a country still better known for somber dramas, suddenly had astronauts in sequined suits, battling glowing cosmic threats. It was goofy, yes, but unforgettable in its daring. Woman in the Moon, Frau im Mond, 1929, revived in the 1960s and 70s. Imagine buying a ticket in the space race era and realizing a silent film from 1929 had already predicted modern rocketry. That was the shock of Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon, rediscovered and revived in the 1960s and 70s. The film told the story of humanity's first voyage to the moon, but the real marvel was its detail. Lang's team consulted scientists and ended up introducing concepts that became reality decades later. The countdown sequence? It first appeared here. Rocket staging, space cabins, even weightlessness, all shown before Apollo. Audiences in the 60s were stunned. Many had grown up thinking science fiction was a Hollywood domain. To see that a German filmmaker had imagined so much so early was both inspiring and humbling. For a nation divided by the Cold War, this rediscovery carried pride, but also unease. Had German imagination been too far ahead of its time? Critics hailed the re-release as a revelation. Some even argued it was more visionary than contemporary space films. For casual viewers, though, the shock was simple. A silent, black-and-white epic had already mapped out the space age. Woman in the Moon proved that German cinema once stood at the very frontier of science fiction. Seeing it revived decades later wasn't just surprising, it was like opening a time capsule that contained the future. Metropolis Rediscovery, Metropolis 1927, restored in the 1960s and 70s. By the late 60s, audiences thought they knew Metropolis Fritz Lang's legendary silent dystopia. But when longer restored versions began circulating, they were shocked to discover how much had been missing. The film, mutilated for decades by cuts and censorship, suddenly revealed new scenes, new characters, and an even bigger vision. On screen, towering skyscrapers loomed, workers marched like machines, and the robot Maria sowed chaos in a divided city. For a world living through Cold War anxiety, the imagery hit harder than ever. Germans saw not just a dystopian fantasy, but a reflection of real tensions, class divides, fear of technology, and the fragility of order. International critics gasped at how modern it looked. Half a century after its debut, Metropolis still rivaled contemporary sci-fi in ambition. For German audiences, the rediscovery carried pride-proof their cinema had once led the world. But it also carried discomfort. Had the warnings about inequality and blind progress been ignored? The shock wasn't just in the restored footage. It was in the realization that their ancestors had already envisioned a future that still felt possible and terrifying. Metropolis didn't just come back to life. It returned as a prophecy, still waiting to be fulfilled. Dawn, Morgenrot, 1960s, experimental short. Not every sci-fi shock came from grand space epics. Sometimes it came from a short film that felt like a nightmare flickering on the screen. Dawn, Morgenrot. An experimental German short made in the 1960s didn't follow conventional storytelling at all, and that's exactly what left audiences rattled. Instead of dialogue and clear characters, it delivered abstract imagery. Shadows twisted across landscapes, glowing shapes floated into view, and sound effects created a sense of unease. It was less a story and more an experience, a cinematic alarm bell, ringing in the middle of the Cold War. Audiences expecting heroes and spaceships were blindsided. What they got was a reflection of nuclear dread and human fragility. The lack of explanation forced viewers to project their own fears onto the images, which made the experience even more unsettling. Some felt it was art, others thought it was nonsense, but no one left unmoved. Critics in avant-garde circles applauded the bravery. The mainstream, however, found it confusing, even frustrating. But that tension was the point. Dawn wasn't designed to entertain. It was meant to disturb, to poke at the anxieties everyone felt, but rarely confronted. In the end, the film shocked because it refused to give comfort. It showed that German cinema didn't always need to build rockets or aliens to create sci-fi. Sometimes the scariest visions came from within. The Parallel Street, Die Parallelstrasse, 1962. If ever there was a German film that baffled and shocked audiences, it was The Parallel Street. Released in 1962, this surreal courtroom-style drama blurred the line between sci-fi and philosophy. The story placed a group of men in a stark room where they were ordered to examine strange documents about faraway lands and bizarre phenomena. The task seemed bureaucratic at first, almost dull, but as the hearings continued, the material became increasingly cosmic questions about humanity's choices, morality, and perhaps even survival itself. Audiences went in expecting a courtroom drama. What they got was a puzzle box that refused to open. Was it allegory? Was it science fiction? Was it a dream? The lack of answers left viewers disoriented. Some critics praised its daring, while others dismissed it as confusing nonsense. And that was the shock. In an era when German cinema leaned heavily on straightforward narratives, The Parallel Street broke the mold. It forced audiences to think instead of offering simple thrills. Its visuals' stark lighting, surreal pacing, and haunting silences made the film feel otherworldly, despite being set in a single room. It's still debated today. Some call it a forgotten masterpiece, others a failed experiment. But its shock value remains undeniable. A film that refused to explain itself, daring audiences to confront ambiguity head-on. Voyage to the End of the Universe, Icaria XB1, 1963. Before 2001, A Space Odyssey or Star Trek. Wowed global audiences, there was Voyage to the End of the Universe. Released in 1963 as a Czech-East German co-production, it stunned viewers with its serious, haunting approach to space travel. In the West, it was distributed under the English title Voyage to the End of the Universe, and many critics later noted how its influence echoed through more famous works that followed. The film followed the crew of the spaceship Icaria XB1 on a decades-long voyage to explore deep space. Unlike the pulp adventures of the era, this story leaned into realism. Astronauts suffered fatigue, paranoia, and despair. They weren't invincible heroes. They were fragile humans trapped in a vast, uncaring cosmos. That honesty shocked audiences who expected simple thrills. The film also dared to confront darker themes. At one point, the crew discovered a derelict ship filled with the lifeless remains of people who had destroyed themselves through violence. For audiences in the middle of the Cold War, the scene felt uncomfortably close to home. This wasn't just sci-fi, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's own destructive tendencies. Visually, Voyage to the End of the Universe impressed with sleek sets, eerie lighting, and a slow, meditative style that anticipated Stanley Kubrick's work years later. Some critics at the time dismissed it as too slow, but others recognized it as groundbreaking. For German and Eastern European viewers, the shock was in the ambition. This wasn't escapist fantasy, it was a bold attempt to imagine space travel as it might truly feel. Instead of reassurance, it offered uncertainty. Instead of triumph, it offered doubt. That choice left audiences unsettled, and it cemented the film's place as one of the most influential, if underappreciated, sci-fi classics of its era. In the Dust of the Stars, Im Staub der Sterne, 1976. Some films shock by being grim, others shock by being dazzling. And there you have it, 15 German sci-fi films that didn't just dream of the future, they startled audiences with bold ideas, wild visuals, and unforgettable risks. From the glitter of Orion to the rediscovery of Metropolis and the cosmic chaos of Message from Space, these movies proved imagination knows no borders. Which one caught you off guard? Share your thoughts, hit subscribe, and join us for more hidden cinematic journeys.